Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin today's discussion, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from just outside of Ottawa, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. The relationship between First Nations people and agriculture, and certainly animal agriculture across this country, goes back centuries and is important to be considered as we think about animal agriculture in the past, present, and future. If you've been following CAPI's work these past few weeks, you know that we've been talking about animal agriculture a lot. Canada's animal agriculture sector should be thriving. We have productive production practices, quality genetics, meaningful animal care practices, efficient feed production, and more. Canada has the land and the water base. We have some of the lowest emissions intensities in the world. Yet our livestock sectors face many difficulties, including what can at times be a challenging policy environment. At CAPI, we try to fill gaps and add value, so we dove into the livestock sector with the intention of empowering policymakers to understand the fundamental strategic components of animal agriculture in Canada in a more holistic way. The work that we do at CAPI is only possible with the support of partners. Today's conversation builds on our recently released white paper on animal agriculture, which was created by exploring the research, engaging a cross-section of stakeholders, preparing a SWOT analysis, key findings, and recommendations that are intended to help guide the future of animal agriculture policy discussions. The original work was funded by CAPI partners, including the Grand River Agriculture Society, UFA Cooperative, Dairy Farmers of Canada, the Canadian Cattle Association, and the Livestock Research and Innovation Corporation. Today's webinar is made possible by the support of GVF Group of Companies, a livestock nutrition company made up of Grand Valley Fortifiers, Valley Feeds, Fortified Nutrition, Farmers Depot, Direct Source Commodities, and TrueFoods.ca. With that, I'm pleased to invite Bruce Schumann, Director of Sustainability Regulatory Quality Management at GVF Group of Companies, to say a few words to kick off the webinar today. Over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Tyler. Good day, everyone. And thanks to CAPI for putting this webinar together and for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Bruce Schumann. I'm a monogastric nutritionist by trade, and more recently I've taken on the newly created role of Director of Sustainability, Regulatory Compliance, and Quality Assurance at the Grand Valley Fortifiers Group of Companies. My position was created in recognition of the growing importance to need and understand sustainability, both in our industry and then assist our producers with it. Our statement of vision is that we empower farmers to produce meat, milk, and eggs profitably and sustainably for the advancement of human lives, nutrition, and health. GVF is proud to sponsor this webinar because it really resonates with us, with our company. It promotes positive production of livestock agriculture in Canada and assists our producers to help grow them sustainably. We know that livestock agriculture is not only important, but will always remain critical in ensuring the sustainability of the world's nutrition. Livestock agriculture provides a complete balance of highly digestible amino acids, vitamins, and minerals that are crucial to growing and sustaining human life. We focus on the environment piece of sustainability, but we know that sustainability is a complex relationship between economics, food security, societal well-being, and the environment. Unfortunately, on the environmental stage, livestock agriculture, particularly ruminants, are being villainized and are often the scapegoat for greenhouse gas emission blame. And it doesn't help our industry that our individual Canadian livestock farmers are poor advocates of their excellent land stewardship and welfare practices, as well as their production and greenhouse gas emission efficiencies. So we need to do our part to educate the public for them. As part of our sustainability strategy and under our pillar, we have fitted each of our delivery trucks in our fleet with graphics of Canadian farms and taglines promoting Canadian chicken, Canadian beef, and Canadian pork, already the most sustainable in the world and still improving. The CAPI white paper has demonstrated that Canadian farmers are one of the most efficient producers of meat, milk, and eggs in the world, and we need to both embrace and communicate that reality to the public, and more importantly, to our leaders and decision makers of policy. GVF has had the privilege to assist in the development review and is fully supportive of the CAPI white paper and the recommendations for forces impacting animal agriculture in Canada that was released back in November of this year. As a company, we believe that we have to enable livestock operations with data-driven insights, help them to use business intelligence solutions that will optimize feed and production efficiency, profitability, resource stewardship, and those will foster ever-improving meat, milk, and egg production. We're working on incorporating the carbon footprints of our products that we manufacture and the ingredients that we formulate for on farm, and have started performing on-farm specific environmental assessments that will be incorporated into the sustainable decisions on their operations. Hopefully, in the not too distant future, the assessments will be used to monitor and validate carbon credits that can be sold within their supply chain as carbon insets, putting money back in the hands of the producers who are responsible for the greenhouse gas emission reductions. With a world focus in mind, we need to promote our producers' environmental efficiencies in terms of carbon equivalents per kilo of product that we produce, rather than trying to reduce an absolute amount of carbon, especially if we are to expand our export market. Lastly, we need to continually be active promoters of Canadian livestock agriculture and demonstrate with metrics to policymakers in Canada and around the world why we need to be at the top of the export market, supplying some of the most nutritious food in the world. I think we also have an obligation and a responsibility as one of the most efficient countries raising livestock to assist other countries in developing worlds with our technology and our knowledge to become more sustainable for the overall good of the world. With that, I thank you again for your time, and will now hand it over to Al Muscle.
Well, thank you, Bruce. And again, thank you to GVF companies for the support of your work. Al, if you're ready, you can kick off our discussion today with an overview of some of the findings from our recent white paper.
Well, thanks, Tyler. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen at this point. Yeah, pleased to be able to draw from the work that both Bruce and Tyler made reference to on our white paper project, along with my colleagues Margaret Zaviru and Angèle Poirier. I'd like to start the discussion today to talk a little bit about food security before we get into emissions and greenhouse gases. And, the concern that we're in a different place today than we've been, certainly for most of my lifetime, and probably true also for just about everybody on the call. And I'd like to start first with the right-hand panel of this slide, which is information that's compiled by the Food and Ag Organization of the United Nations on food prices. The line to look at here is a yellow line, which is the inflation-adjusted cost globally of a basket of food products. And what you can see is even as over the last several months rates of food price inflation have fallen, we're still back at mid-70s levels, which again probably means for just about all of us on this call, I would expect, we're at all but record high food prices. An important element of that has to do with cereal grains, that is feed grains, which of course are most pertinent to the topic that we're going to talk about here, but also food grains, wheat and rice. That's the left-hand panel of this slide. And as you can see, going back over the last number of years, production of cereal grains has gone up fairly impressively. However, it has struggled to keep up with utilization of cereal grains. The result being that we've struggled to be able to build stocks of grains. And in fact, for this year, we're projecting, the FAO is projecting that stocks may go back up to levels last experienced in 2017-18. But you think about last year, even with the inventories of grain trapped in Ukraine, we still couldn't get back to 2017 levels. So what we have is an environment of scarcity in the grain complex that we haven't experienced in probably several generations. And of course, this factors into what we can do in animal agriculture, because a significant portion of our animal agriculture is motivated by feed grains, and economically, animals go to feed. Feed does not go to animals. Now, as Bruce made reference to in his opening remarks, if we have and animal foods are healthy, they're appropriate foods. We have a recent FAO study just released a couple of weeks ago that goes through the various in sundry elements of health that they find animal foods are centrally related to, particularly children's nutrition, people suffering or preventing non-communicable diseases, women of reproductive ages, and the various problems that we have or can run into with deficiencies. When you think about scarcity in the grain complex, that maps through into animal agriculture, and we look to animal proteins to be able to to some degree offset that, but you can't have scarcity in grain and not have scarcity in proteins that are created from grains. Now, the FAO study does not give us, as far as I can tell anyway, particular metrics of deficiencies globally in animal proteins, but rather, thinking about my previous slide that talked about some of the side effects of deficiencies, they do quote across different regions of the world here some of the various symptoms of deficiencies in animal proteins. You see this growing throughout the developing world. Probably some of that is population growth, but in other cases, these are rates of growth. But also, even within developed countries, we have significant problems, health problems, dietary problems that can be traced back to consumption of animal foods and deficiencies in consumption of animal foods. Let me go take this back around now again to talk about the production basis for ag and food sectors. So where is food produced in the world? Well, it's not uniformly distributed. There's specific areas of the world where the bulk of agricultural production comes from, and you can see where they are on the map. And fortunate for us, we're part of that production system, along with the big population centers in the world: Eastern Asia, notably China, Southern Asia, notably India, as well as South America and parts of Europe. What that means is that production is concentrated in specific countries, and it's remarkable. I'm thinking about some of the work we did a couple of years ago through a fellowship in trade, where we looked at the concentration of net exports across a whole range of commodities, and you can see them on the screen here. But the way to read these graphs is to start at 12 o'clock and move clockwise. And how far do you have to get before you have 6 countries, and what market share do the top 6 countries have? And you go and look at beef. Top 6 countries, 84% of the production. Canada just squeezes in just above that on beef. On pork, Canada's within that level. 6 countries, 95% of the production. So it's very concentrated. We have to be very concerned with production conditions in individual countries, and the intensity that comes from those countries in terms of providing for the global food supply. Let me turn now a little bit more to some of the systems work that comes out of our white paper. In order to be able to make sense of emissions and efficiency in animal production systems, you have to be able to look at it as a system, as a whole. Animals can operate in a diverse set of production systems based on forages, based on grains, and converting and upcycling that with the benefit of co-products and utilizing unusable other products, waste products, etc., into converting food. Some people will look at this and look for specific metrics of efficiency. For example, how efficient are the animals in converting grain into milk, meat, and eggs, and they want to run with specifically that metric. And that will take us in a bias towards particular sorts of animals, monogastric animals, more so than ruminants. Same time, we have other dimensions of the production system that ask, how do we convert otherwise not human edible products into milk, meat, and eggs? And when we look at just that metric, that takes us towards ruminants that can digest a broader range of products compared with monogastric animals, reminds us that it's a very complex production system. When you take some of that complexity and look at how Canada compares internationally, and I'm just looking at an efficiency basis now, this particular metric happens to be a feed conversion. This is work done by the FAO using the GLEAM model. North America here consists of Canada and the United States. Mexico, I believe, goes under Latin America. And you can see under a broad range of production contexts for dairy and beef, North America, Canada included, looks very efficient. When we take a look at this on the basis of, before we get into that, in terms of Canada's emissions, when we go and look at where animal agriculture fits in, our benchmark for goes back to the Paris Accord. Our benchmark is 2005. Agriculture as a whole is about 10% of the emissions when that includes on-farm energy. And when you look at animal agriculture is typically about 50% of those emissions. Now, over time, animal agriculture's emissions have been declining, and I think that's fairly consistent with the decline in the cow herd. So if you look at that, if you look at the light green part of this graph here, it's narrowing down over time. When we compare ourselves internationally on an emissions basis, Canada looks very good. So this is more work here from the GLEAM model. This happens to be for pork, as you'll see in a moment. When you look at ruminant agriculture or other monogastric animals, it's very similar. This breaks out some of the components of emissions in Canada and the United States, and you know, one of the big differences here is the feed production component. And North America, Canada, and the United States are very efficient producers of feed, and animals will go where the feed is, not the other way around, absent some form of subsidy that contorts that basic relationship. In the white paper, we took some of the benchmarks from the GLEAM model at a global level, and we worked in with that some of the Canadian research that had been done in beef, pork, and chicken. And I'll have something to show you here in a moment on dairy. When we do this on a comparable basis, Canada is very much at the very low end of emissions, very low emissions intensity. This is information developed by Dairy Farmers of Canada. And again, very similar trend. And you know, it kind of shouldn't surprise you, because what a dairy cow eats isn't a whole lot different than what a steer eats, and the efficiency in that transformation is pretty fundamental to these emissions. So, what I think we should take away from this is that you know, Canada is a pretty efficient producer in animal agriculture. And it's also a pretty low emissions intensity animal producer in animal agriculture. Now, there are some complications. Animal systems are complex, and I think we need to recognize that. one of the source of complication is the emissions from animals are not just greenhouse gases. We also have emissions of nitrogen that can leach down into the water table, phosphorus that can run off and affect water courses and accelerate eutrophication. We can have contamination with coliforms. It's not necessarily the case that measures that are taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will also reduce the emissions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and coliforms. And depending on a local situation, it's not necessarily the case that greenhouse gases should be the priority over issues around nitrogen, phosphorus, and coliforms. All of these issues have to be managed. Within greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, over the last few years, some of the research has been suggesting that we move from a global warming potential 100 standard to a global warming potential star standard, and I think we have others on the call that are more technically able to get into this topic, but really what it says is, or the implication rather, is that when we look at ruminant emissions are governed by a ruminant emissions of methane specifically are governed by a biogenic carbon cycle, which is sort of a full circle type of cycle. So when you have the methane emissions from ruminants, in a sense, it's not new methane into the system. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to reduce methane emissions in agriculture and from animals, including from ruminants, because methane is a very important global warming gas. But it is possible that the contribution of ruminants has been exaggerated. We need to keep that in some context. I guess finally, there's an intrinsic relationship, which is both biological and economic in nature, between grasslands and grazing farm animals. You know, if we take actions to reduce greenhouse gases that negatively impact the economics of grazing farm animals, logically we will lose grasslands. Conversely, if we don't have grasslands for whatever set of reasons, if we've had a change in land use, it will impair the productive capacity that we have for grazing animals and ultimately ruminants that are fed out further down the supply chain. So that's an intrinsic connection, and you can't just pick and choose one level at which you're going to intervene or affect these systems. So where does this leave us? Well, first of all, the world has a food security problem, and I think for many of us that's difficult to fully conceptualize, but we do. We have a food security problem, and we particularly have a protein problem. And there's not that many countries in the world that have capacity supply others with farm products in general, but protein in particular. We also have a climate change problem. And, you know, the number of players that can influence both emissions from animal agriculture and have the capacity to export are few. But we're one of them. We're a major player in these systems. So when we think about the dialogue around animal agriculture and climate change, how do we create joint objectives and priorities, or conversely, how do we prevent one from cannibalizing or contrasting with the other as we figure out how we move toward coherent policy that rationalizes both food security and climate change? And I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Tyler. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Al, for that overview. And so we'll get into that discussion now. And keeping in mind that today we're recording this webinar the day after the first Agriculture and Food Day at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP28 in Dubai. This comes after a series, the United Nations Food System Summit, that was looking on sustainable food systems. And so we have this real increasing focus around what role does livestock, animal agriculture, play in sustainable food systems. And so to help dive into some of these things, we've got 4 panelists that'll take part in the discussion today. We're going to start. I'll introduce each panelist, ask them a question, And then once we're done that round, we'll get into the group discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tim McAllister. Dr. McAllister grew up on his parents' cow-calf farm in Innisfail, Alberta. He is a research scientist in rumen microbiology, food, and nutrition. He's been doing that since 1997. His research focuses on microbiology, nutrition, and beef production, and on food and environmental safety issues related to livestock production. And he has extensive research experience in GHG emissions related to animal agriculture. Dr. McAllister has been recognized internationally for his leadership role and significant contributions to agricultural research and innovation. Dr. McAllister, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to start with a question around the science and how that science of sustainability and of sustainable livestock systems is evolving. If you look at the work that you and your colleagues at Agriculture Canada and collaborators around the world are doing, what's changing and what do we know today that we didn't know maybe 20 years ago?
Thanks, Tyler, for the opportunity to share some thoughts. Yeah, I think the most dramatic change we've heard, climate change and the issues around greenhouse gases, they've been around for a few years now, going back into the 1990s when we really first started to look at it in a serious manner. And over time, I think we've really seen an evolution and a greater appreciation for the importance of taking a systems approach. And, greenhouse gases are important and we need to be cognizant of their impact on the environment, but also looking at the interactions of other factors. Al mentioned some of those, the other nutrients that can accumulate in the environment and cause potential problems if they're not managed properly, but also branching out into areas like biodiversity and the interaction of livestock and the impact that it can have on biodiversity. And really what we're looking at is using that systems approach and assessing trade-offs. It's always about matching the agricultural system in an optimal manner to the environment in which it's being employed. And those are not the same in various regions of the world. We need to take an assessment of those regions and develop agricultural practices that are specific to the regions in which they're being applied. And that's a big challenge. It's actually a lot more complicated when you look at those interactions than just looking at greenhouse gas emissions.
And how do you balance that off, right? So we do know that a lot of the focus is on greenhouse gas emissions. That's clearly what's being talked about right now in Dubai. But Canada hosted the Montreal conference around biodiversity last year, and there is this need to think more, as you say, take a more systems approach. What does that balance look like, and how do you, from that science perspective, try and create systems or models or approaches that understand how those dynamics play out?
Yeah, well, you really need expertise from a very diverse range of scientists across all those areas. There's no one scientist that has the expertise across all of the various components that can affect the agricultural system. There is an organization called the Livestock Environmental Agricultural Partnership, which is organized by the FAO, and they've been developing guidelines that look at livestock emissions, nutrient flows, manure management, and they're moving into even some of the broad areas. Biodiversity was much more difficult to quantify, because there's a certain amount of subjectivity in that as well. Certain people value more certain species over others. Some people see, I know when people land in Alberta, when we bring students in, they're really impressed on how beautiful magpies are, their colorful foliage and that. But when you look at many people see them as a pest. So it becomes much more difficult to develop some of those quantifiable parameters for things like biodiversity or the role of livestock in a circular bioeconomy, for example. When you start to look at circularity and the various flows of carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients that we see in those systems. And then it even gets more complex when you move to the next level, which is really ecosystem services, where you evaluate both all of the positive and negative aspects that may arise from an agricultural system.
And so often when we talk about eco services, we talk about eco services payments. I'm interested, Tim, and if you could share your thoughts, your perspectives around the announcement over the weekend from the Government of Canada around the ruminant, the emissions protocol, the draft protocol that they've been released around reducing emissions from cattle, in particular beef cattle, in particular through feed additives. What's your sense as to how much of an impact that protocol and the potential credits that will generate it from it will have on emissions reduction. Is this something that beef producers in particular in this case should be paying close attention to? Will this be something that we see farmers across the country getting credits out of in the near future?
Yeah, that the protocol was developed by Environment Climate Change Canada with input from scientists and industry representatives across the country. And I really see it as a starting point. We got to start somewhere if we're going to start recognizing practices that lead to lower overall carbon emissions. And you know, adoption was often, you mentioned about the profitability and the contribution to overall profitability of the industry. We need to make sure that it's clear that there's a connection to there being value added by producers lowering emissions, and that value added has to come with the context of the efforts that it takes to track those emissions and record them and measure them and meet the requirements in order to be deemed suitable for getting those credits. So I think there will be definitely uptake of it. But I think Environment Canada is also sort of testing to see what kind of adoption they get. It's right now it's under a 60-day review period. So anybody can go on and make online and make comments with regard to what they think about the protocol. You know, I think from a producer perspective, it's still fairly complex. They're probably going to need some assistance or some input from people that are a little more familiar with the area and how we estimate those emissions. It's all largely based on what we call a life cycle analysis, which sets up boundaries of where we measure those emissions across those boundaries, and then look for reductions that occur from a pre-measurement period, what we call a baseline assessment. So it will encourage adoption, I think, and there are technologies emerging. There's a lot now that are looking at reducing emissions are related to diet formulation and reducing the time it takes for an animal to reach a finishing phase. So the quicker we can get animals ready to be processed into meat, then the lower the emissions will be associated with that production system. So a lot of the technologies are targeted at lowering the length of time that requires.
But do you really see this as, you know, our first kick at the can? I know that Alberta, other parts of the world have protocols in place, but this is I think the first federal protocol that's gotten far in the agriculture context.
That's correct. On a national basis, that's right. And they're looking at additional areas within agriculture as well. So this is their first one that they've announced, and they're working on others as we speak.
Great. Thank you, Tim. We'll bring you back into the discussion later on. I'll go to our second panelist, Dr. Ellen Goddard. Dr. Goddard is a distinguished fellow here at CAPI, but she's also a professor and cooperative chair in agricultural marketing and business at the University of Alberta, where she's been since 2000. Over the past 30 years, her research is focused on economic modeling of domestic and international markets for food products, particularly meat, for policy analysis purposes. Her current research includes various aspects of food behavior, including consumer response to food safety incidents and consumer interest in labels. Ellen, thank you for joining us, and I want to get right into the consumer demand piece. And I think we often talk about the desire for more sustainable systems, but that can seem disconnected at times around what consumers are actually willing to pay for. So can you kind of share what the research tells us about what consumers know or what they think they know about the sustainability of animal agriculture and whether or not they're willing to pay more for it?
Thanks for having me, Tyler. It's not an easy question to answer in some senses. I think Tim's answer showed how complicated the science has gotten over the last 20 years. And if the science is getting more complicated over the last 20 years, then public perceptions are also getting more nuanced, perhaps, but also more perhaps confused by the number of different messages that are coming at them from different directions. My research would show that the public is getting more sophisticated about sustainability, that if the news and the scientific results are all focused on greenhouse gas emissions, then that's something that captures the public's attention, and they want to figure out how their own choices affect greenhouse gas emissions, and that's not always easy. They look for ways to simplify those decisions by looking at who they trust, and the people they trust are saying things. In general, they trust farmers a lot, which puts a lot of pressure on farmers to communicate messages, I guess, in agriculture. But they also trust some of the environmental NGO groups like the World Wildlife Fund for their messages, and they trust scientists. So all of those bodies have a role to play. In general, the public would like something really simple. Can I go to the grocery store and can something tell me product A versus product B? Am I doing something good or bad for greenhouse gas emissions? We don't have those standards yet. We have multiple messaging around certain products. Sometimes it's through advertising, sometimes it's through labeling. And that, I think, is frustrating for the public. But they're pretty sophisticated in what they're looking for. They are looking for greenhouse gas emissions. They are looking for other indicators of environmental health, like biodiversity, water quality, those sorts of things. So we need to respect them.
But Ellen, what do we know about what they're willing to pay for then?
Well, that's a double-edged sword. When we think about it, often we think about it in very simplistic terms. Anything we do that requires labeling or verification or standards or whatever is going to change practices, require more record keeping, will engender costs for people along the supply chain, including farmers. If I'm paying $10 for ground beef today, am I going to pay $12 when it comes with a verified label on it? Not necessarily, but I might stop paying the $10 if I don't know anything about the beef. So maybe it's a ticket to maintain your place in the market as much as it is something to add value. And that in and of itself is adding value to the public. So pay more or keep paying the same are all parts of the same sort of decision.
And you talked about some of the complexity of consumers. You shared some data earlier around the different perspectives between the Canadian consumer and Australian consumer and a UK consumer. And I think it illustrates some of the dynamics that we play, especially in a global marketplace where many animal agriculture products are exported around the world. Can you kind of talk more, Ellen, about that complexity of consumers, how that perception looks like around the world, and how you try and manage that?
Well, first of all, it's really important if you're a country like Canada that's an exporting country, that you understand that things you produce for Canadian consumers with the attributes may not be as attractive in some of our export markets. We may need to emphasize different things or develop different standards. But what's interesting is Australia and Canada are both exporting countries, largely for ruminant products, and also Canada in the case of pork. But the UK is a bit different, and was a part of the EU for a very long time and has very different standards. So a simple thing I did was ask people about the three planks: social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic viability, as to which they think is the most important. And I think pretty generally the public was a little bit confused about economic viability, which is odd, because if you ask them if they want to support farmers or think farmers need a reasonably high standard of living or reasonably high returns for what they produce, they adamantly agree with that. But in the context of sustainability, I think they didn't see that as fitting. And most people think the environmental part of that in the public is the most important plank. But what's really interesting is that in the UK, the social part of it is very much more important than the other two, and statistically significantly more important over time. And that's interesting because it must be associated with their very strong interest in animal welfare, which are less nuanced in Canada and Australia. Do they have better animal welfare than we do in Canada or Australia is a completely different question. But they do want to see it recognized in terms of sustainability in a much more direct way in the UK than in other countries. And those are only 3 countries I picked. I didn't have to change the language of the survey too much, but if you look across the globe, it's going to be way more variable than even those 3 countries.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's very good context to have for today's discussion. So thank you, Ellen. We'll come back to you. Before we go to our next panelist, I'd just like to remind all of our audience members, please feel free to use our chat function, and they can submit any questions for our panelists, and we'll get into those after. So our next panelist today is Kathleen Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan joined Maple Leaf Foods in 2023 as VP for Government and Industry Relations. She brings to the role over 28 years of government advocacy, trade, and food sector experience, including senior leadership positions at several industry organizations, including Food and Beverage Canada, the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada, and Restaurants Canada. She also spent 3 years as a senior policy advisor in the Ontario government, including to the Minister of Education and in the Cabinet Office. Kathleen, thank you very much for joining us today. Kathleen, Maple Leaf Foods has got a world-leading commitment to sustainability. It made quite a splash when it came out as the world's first carbon-neutral food company. I think that there's obviously a lot that goes into that commitment and to the efforts that Maple Leaf Food is making. But part of that is that it is a publicly traded company, and we see these pressures, these demands from investors, but also around disclosure, and a lot of the discussion around sustainability in Canada today, I think, is often seen about public policy, but the private policies of companies like Maple Leaf and value chains are increasing. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to how Maple Leaf Foods is dealing with that intersection of sustainability, animal agriculture, the value chain, and these other pressures that it faces as a publicly traded but private company.
Sure. So, I think for any company, there's a lot of different stakeholders that you consider when you think about the decisions you make, whether that's from a commercial standpoint, a production standpoint. But, more and more companies, as you pointed out, are looking at other aspects of what they do or the impact that they have on things like the environment, on society around them, on their communities. And I think companies, in terms of how they're going to balance all of that, come to it different ways. In Maple Leaf's case, a number of years ago, we actually created a blueprint, and the decision was made, really led by our CEO at the time, now our executive chair, Michael McCain, that we were going to be a shared value company. And from that, the company really embarked on a process of trying to figure out what that meant for us. And we really identified a number of pillars that we were going to focus on, one being environmental sustainability, but others were impact on the community. We do a lot of work from a public policy standpoint on food insecurity, also animal welfare, food safety, for reasons that are perhaps more germane to our production. So I think that shareholders, how the public feels about these things, were a consideration in all of that, but it was really a decision that was made for a lot of different reasons. And one of those really was just a real conviction on the part of our CEO at the time that, and you'll have heard Michael say this, as meat producers, we are environmental protagonists, and we have an obligation, regardless of our shareholders, regardless of other things, we have an obligation to actually deal with that. Is that important to our shareholders? Of course, we'd like to think so. Is that important to our customers? Of course, we like to think so. It's also just the right thing to do. And I think that, any company is going to come at the decision to focus on environmental sustainability by a different blend of all of those different factors that come together.
And so how are you engaging the rest of the value chain? Again, we often talk about how farmers are the front lines. When you talk about being that protagonist, I think it's farmers that are there, but I think increasingly we're seeing companies playing more of that, I'll call it a leadership role in this space at the same time. So what does that look like for Maple Leaf Foods and this animal agriculture value chain that exists?
So the thing about Maple Leaf Foods that I think a lot of people don't realize is that we are farmers. So we manufacture products in 4 main areas. There's a plant-based protein, prepared meats, we have poultry, and then we have pork. And when it comes to pork in particular, we ourselves own and operate almost 200 hog farms. And we own and operate 5 feed mills. The vast majority of that is in Manitoba. We've got 4 farms in Saskatchewan, but really our agriculture footprint, we do have some hatcheries in Ontario, but most of our agriculture footprint is in Manitoba. So if you look at our pork supply chain, we encompass the whole thing. We've got feed, we've got production, we've got processing, we've got domestic sales, and then we've got international trade. And so we really capture the whole system within our company, which is makes us, I think, more liable, if you will, in terms of our environmental footprint, but it also gives us more control over how we're going to address that, and gives us more of a line of sight on how the pieces all fit together. So in terms of looking at measures that can address our environmental footprint, now, bear in mind, we made very specific commitments. So back in 2019, when we announced that we were carbon neutral, we also made very clear commitments about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions across our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And for scope 1 and 2, our commitment was to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. For us, that's really about dealing with our manure. So if we just as a company are able to deal with the manure from our pork production in our system, that would get us to our targets. So in some ways, that's a complex problem to take on, but in other ways, it's relatively simple to see the math in terms of, okay, if we took action here, we could actually affect the outcome over there. And so that's really where we're focusing our efforts. Obviously, every company is going to be different. Some companies in animal production are more integrated than others are. I think where you are vertically integrated, it starts to become a little bit clearer. If you push a button here, what could happen, and you've got control over that. But these are costly measures, and they're very complex measures. And I think that's really the big lesson that we are learning.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. And again, complexity seems to be one of those themes that are already coming up in the discussion. And so we'll go to our 4th panelist now, Ryder Lee. And again, Ryder represents, works with the Canadian Cattle Association as the general manager. He works closely with CCA's elected leaders, the farmers, and engages with his divisional leads on the files that keep active policy and strategy aligned. Ryder's background is with the Domestic Agriculture Committee and Animal Health and Care Committee. He's worked over the years, have driven his focus on direct involvement with producers and what they face. Ryder worked for the CCA in Ottawa from 2005 to 2015, where he was responsible for advancing federal and provincial files. He was chair of the National Farm Animal Care Council from 2014 to 2022. And from 2015 to 2022, Ryder was CEO of the Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. Ryder's brother runs the ranch in southern Saskatchewan, where he spent his early years. Ryder, thank you very much for joining us today. You know, the Canadian Cattle Association, along with associations like Dairy Farmers of Canada, Egg Farmers of Canada, and others, have been aggressive in defending the sustainability of their farmers, including reinforcing the commitments that have already been made to make ongoing improvements in the sustainability. You know, a lot of that work has been front and center in Dubai at COP28, where CCA and other associations have representatives talking about the sustainability of Canadian farm production. But I was wondering if you could just start by sharing some of what CCA's environmental work plan looks like. How does that play into events like COP, and what has CCA been doing before, during, and after around these issues of sustainable production systems?
Yeah, that's a few questions, Tyler, but I'm glad to weigh into it. You know, this really is a local, but a national, but an international conversation. And so much of our environmental work happens locally. It's ranch, by farm. There's different regulations in each province. Even the municipality you're in might have some impact on things, how different species interact. So many different challenges that are a local conversation. Like you said, this gets complex, and but then it rolls up to the provincial rules and regulations and challenges, and then national, and where is funding for research coming on, and what research needs doing that addresses that local challenge versus that provincial challenge versus wider challenges too. So you get into, you're doing things locally yourself, but there's also a lot of collective action going on. So producers working together, It's their dollars funding a lot of research that goes on spreading best practices, sending people like CCA to engage with governments and other stakeholders, like through the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, or having people on the ground in Dubai. COP28, other international events are often where regulations and policy kind of begin. Not necessarily in detail, but in spirit. So we've really been working to ensure that policy and regulations are informed by our realities. Al did a good job of shining a light on, there's differences on whatever we produce around the world and what the impacts are there. So we can't let just generalities be part of those conversations, or leave the conversation to people that would love to take meat off the plate or cattle off the land. They're very well organized and present in some of these forums, so we need to be there. So before and after COP, CCA works, like you said, on behalf of cattle producers. We've got the BCRC, the Beef Cattle Research Council, working on research, funding, and coordination. And other groups as well to tell Canadian cattle producers' story and ensure those things are based on the best knowledge of their impacts. And there's lots of things around CAP specifically that are, engaging with Environment and Climate Change Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and how they're doing things in Dubai, but also with, NGOs from around the world, others in dialogues about cattle's role and what we're working on. Hosted a couple events at COP on Canadian beef sustainability and grasslands. So there's a couple pavilions there. I think maybe I hit the news about Saskatchewan Pavilion, but it was a place that we were able to use to have some of these conversations. The Canadian Pavilion too, and several other events, just part of being there that worked. And after COP, we'll continue the communication and follow up on lots of declarations and talk about methane. But one that I'm really glad to see is I think there's starting to be a frank conversation that we're going to have more people, and these people need to eat, and they need to eat good stuff. And that's where I think Canada, as a country that's able to export, fits well.
And Ryder, I think one of the tensions that we see play out is often, Ellen talked earlier about how farmers are trusted. Farmers have this story that they tell around sustainability. I think, in the face of a community of interest that would like to see people eat less beef or are concerned about the footprint, that there can be this tension between farmers, feeling to defend the status quo. And I think sometimes what gets missed is this commitment for continuous improvement that's being made. And can you just maybe talk a little bit about that side of what CCA has been doing as you try and drive for long-term improvements in sustainability at the same time as talking about how sustainable beef already is today?
Yeah, and if you're standing still, really you're moving backwards. And as a export and open trading nation, our competitors are knocking at our door, or else knocking on our customers' doors at the same time as us. And increasingly questions are asked around sustainability. What are you doing? What are you measuring? What's your impact? So we can't be silent in there, just saying, stop asking, we're good. So for Canada, we have what's called the National Beef Sustainability Assessment. That was a first go at looking at, okay, where are we at in all of this? And we're looking at renewing that. I think our first one came out in 2016, and our next one's going to come out anytime now. And looking at, peer-reviewed science that shows where are we and where are we going? What have we done better and can be doing better across a whole bunch of gamuts? Because like it was said, greenhouse gas is just one part of it. What is, the water, the land, the other environmental services. And this also points to a bit of the challenge in all of this. What is the baseline? How are we measuring things? And even with, new protocols coming out, what's the measurement burden going to be? what do I have to do different? Who has to come to my place to measure it? How often? And every time some of those things happen, well, there's a cost to it. Is there anything left for the producer to incentivize them for making that change, or is it all chewed up in the examining and the looking at it?
And Ryder, you talked earlier about, this is the local, provincial, national, and then international. And when you think kind of going in the other direction, so nationally, you've set goals and targets for improvement, you're delivering these plans. What does translating that backwards then down into, you've got these national goals, but what does that mean for a farmer? What does that side of CCA's work plan look like?
Well, you don't want it, or I don't want it to sound trite, and it isn't trite, but it's a reality that farmers and ranchers want their businesses to be viable and better than they were when they got them, so that their next generation can take those over. And that sounds pat or contrived, but it's the reality. These are family businesses, and that sustainability piece, I think some of the metrics, some of the volume of the conversation around it, and some of the things that we stare at a little harder now than say 30 years ago are a difference, whether it's greenhouse gas or other things. But so much of it, whether it's water, land management, efficiency, those have been, and constant improvement in those have been going on for a long time. And that's why I think we're such big proponents of science-based and rules-based trade that allows those things to continue that march of improvement forward.
Great. And so Ryder, I'm going to ask you a question that will then go around, bring all of our other panelists in on. Start with a question at a high level, and we'll drill down later. But ultimately, when you think about all of these things today, is sustainability an opportunity or a challenge for animal agriculture in Canada?
Well, yeah, like I said, it's not news. It's always been a reality that you can't take that for granted, and we're keeping score of some things differently. But I think we're doing so well in Canada that it is an opportunity, but we're still figuring it out. How do we keep score? How do we grab a hold of some of the value that may be out there? But even is it? Consumers like to get, we lump consumers in and say things are important, but then it's always hard to find the dollars that they'll lay on the table for things that are important. But I think we've got a great story. We're doing great relatively. Just will we keep rules-based and science-based trade in there so that those that are doing better will be able to benefit? We'll see.
And Kathleen, I would imagine, when you think about Maple Leaf Foods billing itself as the world's first carbon neutral company, you see sustainability as an opportunity, but is it what does it take, or what does ensuring that it's an opportunity, not a challenge, actually mean or look like?
So I would reposition that a little bit. I think it is an imperative. I don't think there is a choice here. I think that it is something that we have to do because it's the right thing to do. I think it's something that we're going to be driven to do. And I think it is incredibly challenging. And, in terms of finding the opportunity, I mean, just to give you a sense, I talked earlier about manure really for Maple Leaf Foods, given our animal production being the greatest opportunity for us to find greenhouse gas emission reductions. We're looking at anaerobic digestion as the solution there, and taking a look at the possibility of what it would take to build an anaerobic digester network in Manitoba. And it would take about $500 million. So it is a challenge. So for us, that's a challenge. And you can imagine if you're trying to look at something comparable to that, I mean, if that is the magnitude of initiative that we need to achieve sustainability or science-based targets across animal agriculture, let alone everything else, this is incredibly costly. And there are a lot of enterprises and players in the agri-food system, agriculture food processing, that somehow need to be coordinated, which is itself a huge challenge. So I think we have what is essentially an obligation or an imperative to achieve a certain outcome, but it's going to be, there's a lot of hurdles that we have to overcome. And I think the conversation is really about how do we overcome those hurdles and how do we try to find some kind of opportunity there, whether that is being able to have a competitive advantage because we're promoting what we've done, those sorts of things. But I think the conversation about whether it's an opportunity, it's a challenge, yeah, it is, but we have to do it, and we're going to have to sort of figure out a way to overcome the challenges and find whatever opportunities we can.
And Ellen, some of the work that you've done has looked at consumer acceptance of technology, and again, when you think about kind of the role, feed additives are probably low-hanging fruit. Again, we've got an emissions protocol that's coming down the pipe, but we have this potential for new and different technologies to play part of it. I don't know if we'll see it anytime soon, but gene editing and livestock is an example of something that may come along and help tackle this. What does that consumer acceptance look like of these technologies, and what role will that play in trying to push for more sustainable systems?
I think it's absolutely great. I've looked at, in particular, at some aspects of gene editing, but other aspects of genomics used for selective breeding, for example. And although the public remains cautious about things called genetic modification, they're less negative about other uses of technology, and they desperately want those technologies used to improve animal health, their own people health, and the environment. And those are not in any order. All of those things are important. So if you can convince the public, and farmers are the best ones to convince the public, by the way, but if you can convince the public that the use of technology is a tangible way of improving environmental quality, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving animal health, they're accepting of it. And that's quite clear, but there's a number of messages that need to be distributed to get from the initial farm production decision to the final consumer. And, companies like Maple Leaf, who have established a benchmark in the sand for being carbon neutral, for example, also will have a lot of clout in some of these other messages if we broaden the discussion about environment or animal health or people health. So I think that it's not impossible. I do think the public understands technology. You just have to remind them of telephones 40 years ago and what a telephone is now. And then they say, oh yeah, that's not too bad. And they also recognize that the technologies applied to their own health through the medical system are vastly different. I will say, oddly, though, the debate about vaccination in COVID has heightened concerns about vaccination in livestock because it's something we never talked about. So the public simply did not know that we vaccinated livestock. So that's a message we need to get out to the public before they're faced with people saying, don't vaccinate livestock. We don't want that message across. But I do think the public is very, very friendly to the idea of the use of technology that benefits society.
And so Tim, I'll bring you in on this point. A big part of that benefit to society, right, will come down to what is the evidence that we have that's come up a couple of times in our discussion. If you think back to whether or not you're trying to convince consumers about the progress that's being made, or you're a producer trying to access an emissions credit protocol, data is a big piece of it. But especially if you're looking at cows roaming grasslands in southern Alberta, that data piece is hard. What's the future of that look like, and how do we solve for this question of having evidence that speaks to the progress that's been made and that will be made around sustainable agriculture animal systems?
Yeah, well, I think we need to keep in mind that there's really a global effort going on in this research space. So there's programs in virtually every country in the world that's studying this in one aspect or another. So our information, our databases are getting increasingly more stronger. There's efforts in terms of more open data so that that data is more universally shared, to deal with this problem. We're really talking about a global issue here. And all countries in the world need to pull together if we're really going to tackle this and make a difference. So that needs to be kept in mind as we move. And so, if you look at the response we had to COVID and how quickly we came up with solutions there, when the world's scientists put their mind to something and there's sufficient resources to support them, they can make changes in a pretty quick period of time. So we're seeing those kinds of improvements take place. All of them have to go through regulatory processes and that for approval, and that takes time. We want to make sure that everything that we come up with is going to lower emissions without having any negative impact on the quality or safety of food or implications for human health. So those procedures need to be followed, but they are being implemented now. We're even seeing more sharing of information amongst regulatory agencies and similar methods in terms of pathways to approval and assessment. So I think as these things come together, we're going to see an acceleration. Another good Alan mentioned about the whole genomics area. There's massive amounts of information that's being stored within databases now that are open to the world, so that we can go in and pull that information. So I think we're really looking at an acceleration that will continue. We've documented some of those improvements over the last 30 years within the Canadian industry, and we expect those improvements to continue into the future.
And Tim, I'll stay with you for a minute. Going to come to Ryder next on this, but we've got a question around companies that are claiming significant reductions in enteric methane production, in part driven by improved feed conversion. Part of the question is what's the validity of these claims, and how might we see some of these at commercial scale in diets of animals, and I really want to drive in around the validity of the claims piece in particular, because I think that a lot of the work that we do relies on models today, but I know on one end you've got consumers that can be skeptical of the models and the claims that are being used, but and Ryder, want to bring you in on this around the kind of the farmers' own skepticism of some of the models, and what do we actually know and how well do these things work? So what's your sense as to how much certainty we have, what the validity that exists today, and how close these things are to reality?
Well, I think they all need to be verified through science and experimentation, and it needs to be kept in mind too that, given the diversity of production systems that we're dealing with, even within the beef industry, from a global perspective, it's highly unlikely that any one technology is going to work under all conditions. And so really they need to be tailored and assessed to the specific system in which they're going to be applied. Right now we have quite a void. Most of the technologies that are available are suitable for animals that are in confinement. So feeding total diets that are mixed, and we can add additives in. That's not very appropriate for animals that are out on more extensive rangelands. So there's a lot of research going on to try to develop systems that will work in that sector as well. So it's really a sector by sector assessment that needs to take place, and ultimately each additive or approach needs to be assessed and peer reviewed from a scientific perspective.
And so, Ryder, it also needs to be assessed and peer reviewed from a farmer perspective. Do these things work? I'm curious as to kind of the role of extension services in particular. How are we making sure that these practices, these approaches that are being promoted to improve sustainability, deliver benefits? What's that engagement with the farmers across the country look like to help translate knowledge into practice?
Well, I'd say agriculture has a good record of picking up and applying the things that move the needle. The risk in some of this that I see is the confounding things to your efforts. So what things that aren't in your control, and how do they affect the measurements that are out there, whether it's a dry year versus a wet year? If it's a whole farm measurements, well, that gets very difficult. So some of the products that that are spoke of or that have looked good in trials, they need to deliver a local benefit to your operation that outweighs the cost. And when they do, we do a pretty good job of shouting about it, and word of mouth helps those things move even quicker. But just the difficulty in measuring some of these things is very, very difficult. And there's also the value chain. What does it want? There's terms like a carbon offset, then there's a carbon inset, then there's a government program. And if I do something that satisfies one of these, will it cancel out my ability to play on this other thing? And you're all probably glazing over a little bit here. Producers too will go, you know, this isn't ready yet. So how do we, and that means everybody from Maple Leaf participants to government, to everybody, package this in a way that is plug and play ready. Do this, it has this impact, this benefit, this cost, this revenue. And I don't know that we're there, and across a large part of it, we're still in early days of the science and of the commerce around a lot of this.
And also bring you in on that point around early days, because again, as much as we're at early days, right now in Dubai, there are 100,000 people together trying to figure out how to encourage faster, more immediate action to solve a global crisis. Al, when you look at kind of what you heard through the white paper process, what we know about what's there, you know, how do we square the circle of, you know, this is an evolving science, it's an evolving marketplace, but yet we need to take action today?
Yeah, well, it's come up several points here. It's a complex system. You know, there are differences in it according to any number of different parameters, you know, regions, soils, temperature, rainfall, etc. You know, one of the things I think about sometimes is, well, and I think Ryder kind of alluded to it a few moments ago. I think that farmers and the ag sector in general, you know, where there are particular points that impact them, they respond to that very immediately, and then that becomes part of the culture of the sector, and these things evolve, but they evolve over time, right? So, like, a lot of what I learned about farming, I learned from my father, and, you know, notwithstanding major changes in technology that occurred over his lifetime as well as my own, he learned from his father, and you know, a lot of that has to do with, you know, assumptions around the environment and so on. I often think if you were to resurrect my grandfather and bring him into the room and say, okay, now we need to worry about greenhouse gas emissions, he'd look at you like you were crazy. Like this was never on their radar screen. And you know, you look at, well, simple things like tillage practices in Eastern Canada. Tillage practices in Eastern Canada are not going to change overnight. And I realize I'm talking about cropping systems now, not livestock. But that has to do with soil types. It has to do with moisture. It has to do with how quick the ground can warm up in the ground to grow the crops that we want to grow. Well, you know, animals, particularly ruminants, large ruminants, because, you know, sometimes said that the cattle industry moves in decades, and there's a reason for that. It's very difficult to now go to a COP28 and say, well, you know, if people kind of losing their mind because we can't do this yesterday. Well, of course we can't do it yesterday. First of all, we have to get it on the agenda. It has to interface with some of our longstanding practices that are there for good reason, and then it has to be adopted and ground, you know, fine-tuned over time. So we have to be patient on this.
And one of the other challenges that we run into, and again, the paper that you worked on and produced highlights, and your presentation earlier highlighted the relative position that Canada is as a supplier of low emissions intensity beef, milk, pork, chicken, poultry products. We've got a question that had come in around, again, in the chicken case, for example, we are a low per kilogram emissions intensity preserved chicken. Our chicken is relatively water efficient. The question highlights that we currently limit production from that. But across all products, if you look at the struggle that we have around, we are a low emissions intensity producer of beef, pork, milk, arguably would be good for the planet if we increased our production of those products while other less emissions intense regions were producing decrease their production. But we have this tension at the end of the day around, can we actually boost production that may increase total emissions at a time when we're driving down emissions intensity? And so Al, your thoughts on this balance around, again, the need to reduce global emissions, the need to reduce domestic emissions, but to boost production that may run counter to that.
Yeah, so first, I think you rolled that out pretty well. I think, everybody needs to understand the implication of being low emissions intention and having capacity to supply other countries is that importing countries, at least some of the importing countries that have higher emissions intensities, if they were to reduce the scale of their animal industries and Canada were to concomitantly expand theirs, and then they import from Canada, the net effect of that would be a global reduction in emissions. I mean, that's pretty important. But that almost sounds like economics 101, right? Now, whether countries are prepared to do that, I'm pretty skeptical of, for a whole variety of reasons. And you can look at how countries behaved over when everybody was hungry for vaccines early on in COVID, how everybody behaved, and that's sort of in the presence of worries about food security, people probably behave somewhat. Countries at least will behave somewhat similarly. But I think in responding to your bigger question, Tyler, I want to go back to essentially the question you asked a few moments ago is whether is sustainability writ large an opportunity or a challenge. I think what Kathleen and Ellen in particular said is well, it's what are the risks of not doing this? Well, so of course we're in this. Inherently, it's an opportunity for Canada because again, I think people need to realize there's such a strong overlap between sustainability relative to emissions and just efficiency. There, one of the things that we're struggling with in as we overlay environment on top of economics is that there's some things that are not priced in, and they're external effects, whatever you want to call it, and that's very important, and we have to do a better job of engaging that. But the fact remains, like if you want to see who's most sustainable, well, you probably want to go and look at who has the most efficient agricultural systems to supply feed to animals, and then manage the conversion part of the feed into milk, meat, and eggs. And we have the feed. Economically, animals go to feed, not the other way around. And in terms of conversion efficiency, if you look at generally speaking how spread out our animal industries are and what kind of a defense that is against disease, and then just generally how low we are in terms of the number of animal diseases that we're positive for relative to other countries in the world, this is absolutely an opportunity for us. There's no question about it. There's challenges, like of course there's challenges, and I think Tim outlined quite a number of those. The one that I guess I've learned a little bit out of going through this white paper process has been, the worry about what Temple Grandin calls biological systems overload, which is, we have such a rush toward efficiency, particularly in the conversion side of the animal, that we unwittingly end up limiting some of the functional aspects of the animal, and there's evidence of this in looking at the conception and reproductive rates of dairy cattle, as we've gone for more and more milk production per cow, or In some of her work, she makes reference to layers and the productivity focus on the lay rate. And then when you put the layers in an aviary environment where they hop up and down, they get fractures, they get bone fractures that nobody would have ever expected, because we didn't pay attention to the genetics of the frame of the animal when we're focused on egg production. So I think that's one of the challenges that I don't think has come up otherwise that I'd raise.
Okay. Thanks. And so I'm going to shift gears just quickly, Ryder. I mean, we're talking about sustainability, animal agriculture in the policy context today. I think I need to ask you about Bill 234 that has been front and center in a lot of the political discourse lately. Your thoughts around this, again, this ask for an exemption from the carbon price from the agriculture community. On one side, I know it's not a huge issue for a lot of beef producers in particular, but it is a big issue for the producer community. So how do you see that playing out, and what do you think how that impacts this long-term drive to reduce the emissions footprint?
Well, and Al captured it well. I think that it does get to be a bit of a economics seminar, but we are working on global emissions, but the things that we do and the constraints that we place on us locally will have an impact on where production takes place. So the things we pile on Canada encourage production elsewhere. And if we take score based on what are we trying to do, and if we're looking at greenhouse gases, then we should be producing more and exporting to a lot of places that relatively have do poorer in that, and the more constraints we have, we'll leak that production somewhere else. So we really do have to look at that. Does the marketplace look at that and value that in the future? I would say right now we haven't gotten to that procurement based on footprint piece, and I'm not in a hurry to get there. I think competing on quality and other things that consumers are looking for in the grocery store is probably the better way to go. But that's where we look at a lot of this, is we're competing at home and abroad against other countries. So let's not start putting one hand behind our back.
Great. And so I want to wrap up the today's discussion with maybe, not one hand behind your back, but how do we put both hands forward? So we'll go around the panel and ask everyone, what is one thing that you think that we can do from a policy, a public or private policy perspective, to grow our competitive advantage in sustainable agriculture? And so Tim, we'll start with you and then go to Ellen next.
Yeah, well, I think the number one thing I'd say, Tyler, is we need to keep moving towards this system evaluation. We need to realize that livestock production systems are connected to cropping systems, which are also connected to our grassland ecosystems. And we really need to come up with solutions that achieve the optimal balance between those to produce sufficient, safe, and high quality food for Canadians and for the world.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Ellen, your thoughts on one thing we can do to grow our advantage?
I'm worried about the measurement aspect of this, and I think we have to continue a focus on ways we can measure, validate, certify, whatever you want to verify, what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we desperately need a baseline. One of the things the agriculture sector has always been unimpressed with is the fact they don't get credit for environmentally friendly things they did 15 years ago, for example, because we haven't drawn the line in the sand properly, and we don't want to make that mistake again, because it frustrates the sector and impedes adoption of a lot of things that could be beneficial for society as well as farmers.
Right. Kathleen, to you next on one thing that we should be doing to grow our advantage.
Yeah, I think we have to expand the number of policymakers who are engaged in the conversation. We spend a lot of time talking to each other, just great. I'd like to see ECCC be part of this conversation, not as a peripheral player, or view us as a peripheral player. I want ISED in this conversation. I want CFIA as part of this conversation because obviously they're connected to us, but they don't look necessarily through that sustainability lens in terms of mechanisms, for example, to validate that we're meeting our sustainability commitments, if in fact that is going to be important for trade. So I think we have to start finding ways to encourage these other, and I will give an example because I think it's really important. Through one of the associations we're members of, we had a conversation with ECCC on plastics and plastics packaging in particular, and the importance that we all know. It sounds trite when we say it, that, you know, food has specific attributes, and packaging for food has important attributes with respect to convenience, food safety, shelf life, etc. And that we just wanted to make sure ECCC understood all of this. And the response we got back was, well, what we do is we draft a regulation and then the markets figure out how to comply with it. Well, wouldn't that be lovely? Like, you know, some problems are just too complex. Some markets are just too fragmented. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And a different way of doing this is to bring everybody to the table, not just from industry, but from governments as well, and say, we've got something that we all want to achieve. Let's figure out how we achieve it in a meaningful way and not just sort of throw the problem back and forth. So that would be what I would want.
Great. And Ryder, if that one thing that we want to achieve is growing our competitive advantage in sustainable animal agriculture, what's one thing you'd say at that table around how we achieve it?
Well, that cooperation that Kathleen talked about can't be discounted, and that means all of Canada, not an us versus them. I think I see Ag Canada as, you know, sees industry as cooperators, but there's other parts of the government that sees us as people that need to be told how to do things and brought into line. But for me, that it goes to the whole. We need to champion our practices as Canada and ensure that science-based regulations and rules-based trade are allowed to be the norm, not the exception. And there's pressure on that. And political decision-making is just such a threat to our competitiveness, to our market access, but ultimately to sustainability. And you don't have to look very far to see cautionary tales. You know, my biggest head scratcher is in the EU around technology. Some of the things, you know, it's been said today, efficiency improving technology is environment positive, but there are several options that they've demonized, they've outlawed and avoided, and that's at the cost not only of the environment, but their consumers and their citizens. So maintaining, improving, and championing how Canada does things needs to become the norm, instead of hearing regulators say, well, okay, we've heard what's said, we need to look at what Europe's doing. Geez, that's not how I capture things.
Great. And Al, over to you with kind of your thoughts around that one thing that we could do to grow our advantage.
You know, I think a lot of the great ideas were taken up by my panelist colleagues, but you know, maybe it sounds kind of silly, but just sort of keeping an open mind on a lot of different things. And I want to grab a couple points. You know, Ryder made reference to rules-based trade, and you know, we've evolved in a particular way in which we understand that you know, or we should understand that Canada's been a big beneficiary of rules-based trade. You know, we're a relatively small economy. We don't have a lot of geopolitical weight, but we were able to take advantage of this. And you know, part of having an open mind is understanding, you know, that can change. And if that changes, it's very bad for us. And it's not just economically bad. It you know, in terms of how we can help the world environmentally, it's environmentally bad too. And just another quick point, and just going to touch on something that came up in one of the questions. Another way to keep an open mind is in terms of how we think about what we do. So one of the questions that's come up is, you know, are there alternatives that allow us to do production systems that are less reliant on grain feeding? And in monogastric animals, my guess is maybe not very much, but in ruminants, there are. And, you know, an example that somebody's raised with me a few times, you know, 50 years ago, when much of the Canadian beef herd was straight Hereford, the heifers had finished on corn silage, and the steers finished on corn silage and very little grain. Now we have a much more diverse portfolio of beef animals today, and not suggesting that we should turn the clock back to 1970, but does it make sense to go back and look? So what would our carcass quality look like? What rates of gain can we get if we if we had particular hybrids we focused on for silage, whether it's barley silage or corn silage or whatever it is, and what could be achieved from that? I think that question warrants being asked, and I'm glad it was raised in the chat.
Well, the most controversial thing said today could be Al suggesting we go back to a Hereford-based cow herd, but we'll save that for another day. Again, so I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Again, I think that this is an important issue, and appreciated their contributions to the thought-provoking dialogue. Want to again really acknowledge and appreciate Grand Valley Fortifiers for supporting the webinar today. Thank you, Bruce, for joining us, and to all of our partners, including CCA, DFC, UFA, ALRIC, and the Grand River Ag Society for supporting the work of the Animal Agriculture White Paper. Please do follow CAPI, stay connected to us through our mail letter, our Twitter and LinkedIn. We have an event coming up at the end of January, beginning of February, around sustainability, and we have more news coming out on that soon. So please do follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Thank you again for everyone for taking part in today's discussion, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CAPI event. Have a great day.
Thank you.